She came on a train he never should have ordered. Gareth Hollow had a list. 17 requirements, written in pencil on a folded piece of paper he'd carried for 6 months. Quiet, obedient, willing to follow instructions without question. What stepped off that train in Billings, Montana, on a gray October morning was none of those things. She was arguing with the station master before her trunk even hit the platform. In German, loudly. Gareth stared, the woman turned, looked him dead in the eye and said, "You must be the rancher. You're shorter than I expected." This is their story. Stay until the end. And drop your city in the comments so I can see how far this story has traveled. The letter had taken 11 days to arrive. Gareth Hollow read it twice at the kitchen table, once in the morning with bad coffee, and once at night with no coffee at all. And both times he came to the same conclusion. He had made a practical decision, and practical decisions were the only kind worth making. The letter was from the Westward Hearts Correspondence Agency out of Chicago, Illinois. It confirmed that one Miss Elsa Reinhardt, age 26, recently arrived from the port of Bremen, Germany, had accepted his terms of arrangement and would be departing by rail on October the 3rd, arriving in Billings, Montana, on October the 9th, assuming no delays. Gareth folded the letter along its original creases and tucked it behind the tin coffee can on the shelf above the stove. He went back to work. He had 17 acres of winter hay to cut before the first hard freeze, 2 fence lines that needed replacing along the north pasture, and a barn roof with a soft spot near the east gable that would cave under snow load if he didn't get to it. He didn't have time to think about the woman on the train. He'd think about her when she arrived. That was, he told himself, the sensible approach. The sensible approach lasted until October the 9th, when Gareth stood on the Billings train platform in his cleanest shirt, which was not particularly clean, holding a handwritten sign with the name Reinhardt, printed in large, careful letters, and watched the train disgorge its passengers into the cold October wind. He'd expected someone nervous. Most of the women he'd heard about through other ranchers had arrived nervous, pale and uncertain, clutching their bags, scanning the crowd with the expression of someone who had made an irreversible decision and was only now beginning to understand that. He had not expected the argument. The argument started at the baggage car. He heard it before he saw her. A woman's voice, clear and unhesitating, cutting through the general noise of the platform in a mix of English and German that he couldn't fully follow. Then a man's voice, irritated, higher in pitch. Then the woman's voice again, lower and more deliberate, the way a person speaks when they have already stated a thing twice and are now stating it a third time for the last time. Gareth moved through the crowd toward the sound. She was standing at the baggage car door with her hands on her hips and her chin tilted up, facing a station employee who outweighed her by a considerable amount and was losing the argument anyway. She wore a dark wool traveling coat, slightly worn at the cuffs, and her hair, dark brown, almost black, was coming loose from its pins in a way that suggested the pins had been losing ground for some time. At her feet sat 2 large trunks and a canvas bag. "I am telling you," she said in English now, slow and clear, "that the 3rd trunk was loaded at Fargo. I watched the man load it. It has a red cord tied to the handle. I want to know where it is." "Ma'am, if it wasn't on the... It was on the manifest. I have the paper." She produced a folded document from her coat pocket without looking away from the man. "Here is the paper. You can read the paper." The station employee took the paper. He looked at it. He looked up. He looked back at the paper. Gareth stopped a few feet away. The woman, and he was fairly certain this was his woman, though the certainty sat uncomfortably in his chest, turned at the movement and looked at him directly. Her eyes were dark and sharp and entirely unimpressed. "You must be the rancher," she said. "Gareth Hollow," he said. "You're shorter than I expected." He opened his mouth. He closed it. She turned back to the station employee. "Find the trunk. I will wait." The trunk was found 20 minutes later in the wrong car, exactly as she had said it would be, with the red cord on the handle. The station employee produced it with the expression of a man who wanted credit for the discovery, and Elsa Reinhardt accepted it with the expression of a woman who saw no reason to give any. Gareth loaded all 3 trunks into the wagon bed without asking for help. She didn't offer any. They started the 40-mile drive north out of Billings in the late afternoon, with the sun already dropping toward the Beartooth Range in the west, and the temperature falling along with it. The wagon seat was narrow, He was aware of her presence beside him in the particular way a person becomes aware of something that doesn't quite fit where it's been placed. For the first mile, neither of them spoke. He had prepared things to say. He had not written them down, but he'd rehearsed them in his head during the 3 days prior, practical things about the ranch and what would be expected and the general schedule of a working homestead. He'd planned to begin with those, establish the facts of the situation, make clear that this was a working arrangement between two adults with a clear set of mutual expectations. "How long is the drive?" she asked. 4 hours if the road's dry, he said. 5 if it's not. She looked at the sky. "It will be 5. He followed her gaze. There were clouds coming in from the northwest, low and flat and gray. He'd seen them earlier and hoped they'd hold. "Might be fine," he said. "It won't be," she said. It wasn't. 20 minutes later, the rain started. They didn't talk much during the rain. The road through the foothills north of Billings was carved into a shallow valley that channeled wind directly into a person's face, and the rain was the kind that came at an angle, which made it difficult to speak without getting a mouthful of it. Gareth pulled his hat lower. Elsa pulled her coat tighter. He noticed, without intending to, that she didn't complain. He'd been braced for it. Some comment about the conditions, some question about how much farther, some indication that the reality of the frontier was landing differently than the expectation. She sat with her shoulders squared and her eyes forward and endured it the way someone endures a thing they have decided to endure. That was the first thing he noticed about her. The second thing he noticed was that she was watching everything, not in an obvious ways, but her eyes moved across the landscape steadily. The ridgelines, the river to the east, the way the cattle they passed were positioned relative to the tree breaks. She was cataloging something, he realized, taking inventory. "You've been on a farm before," he said. She glanced at him sideways. "My family had 40 acres outside Bremen, dairy cattle, rye and barley." He nodded. "Your fences need work," she said. "The ones we passed 2 miles back." His jaw tightened slightly. "I know. The bottom wire is rusted through in 3 places. That will not hold a calf, let alone a full-grown animal." I said I know. "I'm not criticizing," she said, in a tone that was not entirely without criticism. "I'm observing." "There's a difference?" She considered this. "Usually." Checked. The rain stopped just before they crested the last ridge above the ranch valley, and the clouds thinned enough for the last gray light of the day to fall across the land below. The valley was narrow, maybe 3 miles wide, flanked on both sides by ridges thick with pine and aspen. The creek that ran through the center of it was running high from the rain, visible as a silver line through the darker grass. The cabin sat on a low rise above the creek, surrounded by outbuildings, the barn, the tack shed, the root cellar, and a pair of mature cottonwoods that had dropped most of their leaves in the last week. It was not, Gareth thought, looking at it with the particular self-consciousness of a man seeing his home through someone else's eyes for the first time, impressive. It was functional. The cabin was solid and weather-tight, and he'd added a second room 2 years ago. The barn was in decent shape. The fences, she wasn't wrong about the fences, needed work. He stopped the wagon at the top of the ridge and let the horses rest for a moment. She looked at the valley for a long time without speaking. "It's real land," she said finally. Not warmly, more like a statement of fact. "It is," he said. "How many head?" 43 cattle, 8 horses, 12 sheep, though I'm thinking of selling the sheep." He paused. 2 dogs. They're not decorative." She almost smiled. He wasn't sure. The light was bad. "I didn't expect them to be," she said. The cabin was colder inside than outside when they arrived, which was a condition Gareth considered embarrassing in a way he didn't have adequate words for. He'd cleaned before leaving for Billings. He had not, it turned out, cleaned in any way that a person visiting the cabin would recognize as such. He'd moved the larger piles into the back room and wiped the table, and that was essentially the extent of it. The floor was swept. The dishes were stacked. The whole place smelled like wood smoke and something he couldn't identify that might have been the sheep, though the sheep hadn't been inside in some time. Elsa walked in, set her canvas bag on the table, and stood in the center of the main room for a moment with her hands clasped in front of her, looking around the way a surveyor looks at a site before drawing the first line. Where do you want me to sleep? She asked. I built the second room for, He stopped. For a family, eventually. There's a bed frame in there. I set up a mattress last week. She walked to the doorway of the second room and looked in. He could see from where he stood that the mattress was slightly crooked on the frame and that he'd forgotten to put a pillow in there. She turned back. There's no pillow. I have a spare blanket. She looked at him for a moment. Something moved across her face that he couldn't quite read. Not anger exactly, something more like a quiet recalibration. All right, she said. He built the fire. She unpacked her canvas bag and produced, among other things, a small bundle of dried herbs tied with twine, a thick German language book with a cracked spine, a folded piece of paper that she smoothed out and placed on the table, and a set of cooking tools that were of noticeably better quality than his own. What's the paper? He asked. My own list, she said. His eyes went to it involuntarily. It was written in a combination of German and English. He could read maybe half of it. What kind of list? The kind I make when I'm going somewhere new. She sat down at the table and looked at him across it with the calm, direct gaze of a person who is accustomed to stating things plainly. Mr. Hollow, I should be honest with you about something. Hollow's fine, he said. What is it? The agency described this arrangement to me as a partnership, a working arrangement between two practical people. She paused. I want to be clear that I understood it in those terms. I came here to work. I can cook, manage livestock, preserve food, maintain a household, and I have some experience with basic timber construction. I'm not fragile, and I don't expect to be treated as if I am. Another pause. But I'm also not someone who will be told what to think or when to speak or how to arrange my own time. If that is what you were expecting, you should know now that it is not what you received. Gareth sat down slowly across from her. The fire was catching behind him, filling the room with uneven orange light. Outside, the wind had picked up. The cottonwoods were audible against the side of the cabin. The agency, he said carefully, sent me a list of the attributes of the women available for correspondence. And I sent my own letter describing myself. You did. He had in fact received her letter and read it 3 times. It had been the most unsettling piece of mail he'd received since his brother's letter 7 years ago. Not because it was unpleasant, but because it was nothing like what he'd expected, and he hadn't known what to do with it. You were more forthright than most. Was that a problem? Not a problem, he said. A surprise. She looked at him steadily. You have your own list. What? The agency told me. 17 items. He felt the back of his neck get warm. That was a practical document. What was item number 4? He didn't answer immediately. Item number 4 was willing to defer to household head on matters of ranch operation and management. Ranch management, he said. And what have I already commented on in the first 4 hours of my arrival? The fences, he said. The fences, she agreed. They looked at each other across the table. The fire crackled. The wind pushed at the window. I'm not going to pretend those fences aren't a problem, he said finally, because they are. Something in her expression shifted. Not softening exactly, but something. No, she said. I didn't think you would. The first week was, in the technical sense, functional. They established a working rhythm by necessity rather than design. Gareth rose before dawn and did the morning feeding and watering before breakfast. Elsa, who he'd expected to sleep until a reasonable hour, rose 15 minutes after him and had coffee started and something on the stove by the time he came back from the barn. Not because he'd asked her to, because it apparently did not occur to her not to. She did not, however, do it quietly. The kitchen became her territory in a way he hadn't anticipated. She rearranged it on the 3rd day, not dramatically, but purposefully, moving things to positions that made more sense to her and that he kept reaching for in the wrong place for the following 2 weeks. She introduced a small pot of something on the back of the stove that she added to steadily over the course of each day, and the cabin began to smell different, more layered, which he didn't know how to evaluate, so he said nothing about it. What is that? He asked on the 4th morning, gesturing at the pot. Soup base. I add to it each day. What's in it? What's available? She didn't look up from the pan she was tending. You had half a smoked ham hock in the cold cellar that had been there at least 2 months. I used some of that. I was planning to use that. For what? He thought about it. Hadn't decided yet. She looked at him then, briefly, with an expression he was beginning to recognize as her version of tolerant amusement. It's better in the soup. It was. He didn't say so. Haussess. On the 6th day, they had their first real argument. It was about the sheep. He'd mentioned in passing the previous evening that he was planning to move the sheep flock to the south pasture before the weather turned, a straightforward decision he'd made without particular deliberation. She'd said nothing at the time. The following morning, when he went to move the flock, she was already at the south pasture fence. This gate latch is broken, she said when he arrived. I know. I'm going to tie it. Tying it won't hold them. The fence on the east side of this pasture is also too low. A motivated sheep will go over it. These sheep are not particularly motivated. All sheep are motivated when they're hungry, and this pasture has been grazed low. She turned to face him. The north pasture is better. The grass is longer and the fence is in better condition. The north pasture is where I'm planning to cut hay next week. Then cut the hay first and move the sheep after. That changes the order of operations. It changes it for the better. He stood at the fence with his hand on the post and looked at her and felt the particular frustration of a man who has been managing a ranch for 11 years, being corrected on livestock management by a woman who has been present for 6 days. You've been here less than a week, he said. I have eyes, she said. I have been using them. This is my ranch. I'm aware of that. She said it without heat, but without apology either. And I am not trying to run it. I am telling you what I can see. What you do with that is your business. She paused. But the sheep will be in your neighbor's yard by Thursday if you put them in this pasture. He put them in the north pasture. He cut the hay from the south pasture first, which took 3 days, and rearranged his entire work schedule for the following 2 weeks. On Thursday, he checked the south pasture fence and found a section on the east side that had a gap at the bottom wide enough for a sheep to push through easily. He didn't tell her. She didn't mention it either. But he noticed the following morning that she had repaired the gap herself, working the wire with a pair of his fence pliers that she'd apparently borrowed from the tack shed without asking. He almost said something about the borrowing. Then he looked at the repair, which was competent, and said nothing. October deepened into cold. There was a particular quality to cold in the Montana valleys that Gareth had lived with so long he barely noticed it anymore. The way it settled into the ground before the air temperature dropped. The way the creek changed sound as its edges began to freeze. The way the cattle moved differently in the mornings, tighter together, their breath hanging in clouds above the herd. He moved through these changes automatically, adjusting his routines the way a person adjusts their stride for different terrain. Elsa noticed everything. She asked questions, direct questions, practical questions, without the apologetic framing he'd expected from someone new to the country. How early did the creek typically freeze? Was the South Ridge a windbreak or a wind channel? Had there been heavy snow the previous 2 winters? Did the cattle drift east or west in a storm? He answered them, most of them, anyway. Why won't you tell me about the east pasture? She asked one evening. He was at the table with a harness that needed resoling. She was sewing something by the lamp. She sewed in the evenings, not decoratively but functionally, mending things. What do you want to know about it? It's been ungrazed all fall. Every other pasture has been used. I want to know why. He worked the needle through the leather. Lost a cow in there 2 years ago. Spring flood washed out a section of the south bank. There's a drop-off now. I haven't had time to fence it properly. How deep? Deep enough. She was quiet for a moment. I'll mark it, so I know where it is. I'll show you in the daylight. I'm not going there alone, she said. I'm not unintelligent. He looked up. She was bent over her sewing, not looking at him. He thought about saying something and decided against it. Saturday, he said. I'll show you on Saturday. All right. And the nights were the strangest part. There was no way around the fact that they were 2 people living in a very small structure, and the walls of the cabin were not thick, and the second room did not have a door yet, only a curtained opening. They could hear each other. Not every sound, but enough. He was aware of her lamp going out each night, aware of the particular silence that followed, aware of his own lying awake in a way he hadn't since he'd been much younger and didn't know yet how to quiet his own mind. He did not examine this awareness. He was not by nature a man who examined his own interior states. He was a man who got up in the morning and worked until dark and slept because his body required it, and this had served him adequately for 34 years. He saw no reason to change the approach now. On the 14th night after her arrival, he heard her crying. It was quiet, the kind of crying a person does when they think no one can hear, muffled and brief and quickly controlled. He lay still and stared at the ceiling and did not move. He didn't know what to do with it. He felt the inadequacy of that with a sharpness that surprised him. In the morning, she appeared at the stove with the exact same expression she always wore, steady and competent and giving nothing away, and made no indication that the previous night had been any different from any other. He poured his coffee and sat down and looked at the table. "Is there something you need?" he asked. He said it to the table, not to her. A pause, the sound of the pan on the stove. "I'm fine." That wasn't what I asked. Another pause. Longer. "I had a moment last night. It passes. I'm fine now." He looked up. She had her back to him, tending the stove. "You don't have to be fine every minute," he said. She turned just slightly, not enough to fully face him. "Neither do you," she said. He didn't know what to say to that. He drank his coffee. She put the pan on the table. Neither of them mentioned it again. But something had changed in the way that small things sometimes change the air pressure in a room. It was the butter churn that broke the ice. Or rather, it was the butter churn that broke. The handle pin snapped on a cold morning in the 3rd week of October. And Gareth found Elsa in the kitchen staring at it with the expression of a person who has discovered an unexpected problem in the middle of an already complicated day. "The pin's sheared," he said, looking over her shoulder. "I can see that." "I have a spare. It's a slightly different size, but I can shape it down." She handed him the churn without comment. He worked the pin out and went to the tack shed for the spare and spent 40 minutes with a file getting it to the right diameter while she did other things in the kitchen. When he came back and reinstalled it and tested it, it worked. She took it back from him. "Thank you." "It'll hold." She looked at him for a moment. "Can I ask you something?" "You generally do," he said. And there was something in his voice that he hadn't entirely intended, something that was almost wry. And she caught it, and for the first time since she'd arrived, she smiled at him directly, fully, without reservation. It was a startling thing to see, not because it was beautiful, though it was, in a way that he noted and then set aside, but because it was completely unguarded in a way that her face usually wasn't. She had, he'd learned, a very controlled face. She didn't give much away. And this was her just smiling because something was mildly funny, the way a person smiles when they're not thinking about whether they should. "What do you want to ask?" he said. "The 2 dogs. What are their names?" He blinked. He'd expected something practical. "Duff, and the other one's just called Dog." She stared at him. "Which one is Duff?" "The big one. And the small one you simply call Dog." "He answers to it." She shook her head slowly and turned back to the churn. "This says something about you," she said. "Does it?" "I haven't decided what yet." "What?" November arrived with the cold front that came down from Canada without any of the gradual transition Gareth had been hoping for. 3 days of temperatures that didn't get above 15 degrees, which by itself wasn't unusual for November, but accompanied by a wind out of the northwest that made 15 feel like something considerably less. The cattle needed checking twice daily. The water troughs froze each night and had to be broken each morning. The horses burned more energy staying warm and needed additional feed. The sheep, it turned out, were fine. The sheep were always fine. He'd never fully understood this about sheep. Elsa adapted without theater. She wrapped the water pipes under the cabin with rags and straw before he'd gotten to it. She adjusted the root cellar covering when she noticed it was losing heat. She developed a routine with the morning fire that had it blazing before the temperature inside the cabin dropped to its lowest point, and he learned without being told that if he was going to be up before her, he needed to add 2 logs before going out. They worked alongside each other with increasing efficiency. Not always in harmony. There were still arguments, regular ones, about methods and priorities and the right way to do any number of things. But the arguments had taken on a different character. They were faster, more direct, less guarded. He'd learned that she didn't argue because she needed to win. She argued because she'd thought about a problem and arrived at a conclusion, and she wanted him to engage with the conclusion rather than dismiss it. When he presented a counter-argument, she considered it seriously. When his counterargument was sound, she changed her position. When it wasn't, she told him why. He found he'd started doing the same. "You're doing it again," she said one afternoon when they were in the barn working through a difficult hay bale storage problem. "Doing what?" "Listening before you argue. You didn't do that at the beginning." He considered this. "You talk faster than I think." She laughed. A short, genuine one. "That is the most honest thing you have said to me." "I'm not a dishonest man." "No," she agreed, more quietly. "You're not." There was a rancher 20 miles to the east named Duval, whose wife had left in September, and word got around the valley the way word got around in isolated places. Slowly, with increasing elaboration, until by the time Gareth heard it from the postman, it had acquired several details that were probably fictional. But the core of it was real enough. She'd gone back to her family in Kansas, and Duval was managing alone. He mentioned it to Elsa without entirely meaning to, over supper one evening. She listened and was quiet for a moment. "Do you think about that?" she asked. "About what?" "Women who leave." He thought about how to answer this. "I think about it the way you think about weather you don't want. As something that might happen." She was quiet again, turning her fork in her hand. "I'm not going to leave," she said. "I want to be clear about that. Whatever else happens, I made an arrangement and I intend to honor it. I didn't come this far to go backward." "What does whatever else happens mean?" She looked at him directly. "It means that this isn't what I expected. Any of it. You're not what I expected." She paused. "I expected someone more manageable." Something in him shifted, not unpleasantly. "And I expected someone more obedient," she said. "I was going to say quiet." "Same thing." He shook his head. He picked up his fork. "For what it's worth," he said, "the soup has been very good." She gave him a look that was almost exasperated. "You have been eating that soup every night for 3 weeks, and this is the first you have mentioned it." "I don't—" He stopped, started again. "I'm not good at saying things." "I know," she said. It wasn't an accusation. It was more like an acknowledgement of a fact she'd filed away some time ago and had made her peace with. "The fences in the north pasture," he said. "You were right about those." She looked at him across the table. The lamp between them was steady in the still air. "I know," she said again, differently this time. "I replaced the bottom wire on the worst section yesterday." "I saw. And I'm going to put a door on the second room before the real cold comes." She didn't say anything for a moment. "You don't have to do that." "I know I don't have to." He set it to his plate, which was the direction he generally aimed difficult statements. "But it's your room. You ought to have a door." When he looked up, she was watching him with an expression he hadn't seen before, complicated in ways he didn't have the language to navigate. Not soft, exactly. More like a person who has been braced against something for a long time and has just received information that requires a recalculation. "All right," she said. "Thank you, Gareth." It was the first time she'd used his given name. He noticed it like a change in weather. By the end of November, the cabin felt different. Not dramatically different. Not in any way he could have pointed to and named. But the accumulation of small things had built into something. Her herbs drying in bunches from the kitchen rafters, the organized system on the cold cellar shelves that he'd stopped fighting because it worked, the way Dog had apparently decided she was his primary person, and followed her from room to room with a dedication he hadn't shown toward Gareth in 3 years of ownership. "Dog likes you better than he likes me," Gareth said one evening. Elsa looked down at the dog, who was pressed against her leg with the expression of a devoted and somewhat stupid devotion. "He has good judgment," she said. "I fed him for 3 years. I gave him a piece of ham 2 weeks ago." "That's all it takes?" She looked up at him. "For dogs," she said, and there was something in the way she said it that might have been something else, something with another layer, and he wasn't sure and he didn't ask. He was getting better at listening. He was not yet good at asking. December arrived without announcement, the way December always arrived in that valley. One morning the light was different, lower and thinner, and the snow that had been holding off finally committed itself, falling through the night in soft, steady waves that by morning had blanketed the valley in 2 feet of white. Gareth stood at the cabin door in the dark of the early morning and looked at it. The barn was a shape. The cottonwoods were white columns. The creek was invisible under the snow but audible still, moving under its skin of ice, doing what it had always done. He heard her come up behind him, her footsteps on the board floor. "First real snow," he said. She stood beside him in the doorway looking out. She had her coat on over her nightgown, her hair down, which he hadn't seen before, which was longer than he'd realized and fell past her shoulders in dark waves. "It's beautiful," she said. He looked at it. He knew this land, every feature of it, had worked it and worried over it and loved it in the way a person loves a thing that has cost them something. He'd never thought of it as beautiful exactly. Beautiful wasn't a word his mind reached for naturally. But standing here in the doorway with the snow still falling and the world below silent and white, he understood perhaps for the first time why someone seeing it new might use that word. "Yeah," he said. "I suppose it is." She stayed beside him for another minute, looking out, not saying anything. Then she went back inside to start the fire, and he pulled on his boots and coat and went out into the white morning to break ice from the water troughs, the same as every morning, except that the valley was new today in a way that settled in him strangely and stayed. The door went up on a Tuesday. Gareth worked it in the morning between the first feeding and the fence repair he'd been putting off, cutting the planks from a section of lumber he'd been storing in the tack shed since the previous spring. It wasn't a fine door. The wood wasn't matched, and the hinges were the spare set he'd pulled off the root cellar when he'd replaced those 2 years back. But it hung level, and it latched clean, and when he pushed it shut, it stayed shut, which was the primary requirement. He didn't tell her it was done. She found it herself that afternoon when she came inside from the cold, and he heard the latch click once, then again, the way a person tests something new. He was at the table pretending to read the tally book. Neither of them said anything about it. But that evening, she made a pot roast with the last of the autumn carrots and set it on the table without comment. And it was the best meal he'd eaten since his mother's kitchen, which was a comparison he kept entirely to himself. December moved through the valley with the unhurried patience of something that knew it had time. The snow from the first fall packed hard in the shadows between the outbuildings and didn't melt, and new snow added to it every few days, so that by mid-December the drifts against the north side of the barn were chest-high, and the path between the cabin and the tack shed had become a narrow trench that Gareth carved out each morning and the wind filled back in each night. The cold was a working fact now, not a condition but a presence, something that had to be accounted for in every decision from before dawn until after dark. They fell into the rhythm of it together, not by agreement but by necessity, the way two people sharing a small space in hard conditions develop a wordless choreography. He knew, without looking, when she was about to come through the front door and would move the drying rack slightly so she had room. She knew, without being told, that he needed the table clear before he could settle his mind for the evening, and cleared it. Neither of them pointed these things out. They simply became true. What didn't smooth over was their temperament. She challenged him on the hay storage arrangement in mid-December, presenting a reorganization plan with the focused energy of someone who had been thinking about it for weeks and had decided that now was the time. He listened to the whole thing before he disagreed, which was progress. He disagreed thoroughly. "If I move the western bales to the loft, I lose access to the lower stack without climbing every time," he said. "If you keep them where they are, the moisture from the ground will spoil the bottom layer by February." She had, he noticed, a way of stating unpleasant facts without raising her voice that was somehow more aggravating than shouting would have been. "I found mold on the lower corner bales this morning." "Which corner?" "Northwest." He put his hat on and went to the barn and looked at the northwest corner of the hay storage and found, on the bottom bale of the lowest row, a soft gray bloom of mold working inward from the edge. He stood there for a moment, jaw tight, then went back to the cabin. "How bad?" she asked, not looking up from the bread she was working. "Caught it early," he said. "Good." She punched the bread down. "Do you want help moving them or not?" "It's heavy work." "I know it is." He looked at her for a moment. She was built lean, but she was strong. He'd seen that. She didn't pretend at tasks she couldn't manage, but she also didn't pretend she couldn't manage things she could. "Saturday," he said. "We'll do it Saturday." "Saturday's fine." They moved the bales Saturday morning in 2 hours of cold, difficult work that left them both breathing hard and packing snow against his right hand where the baling wire had caught it. She wrapped the hand herself with a strip of clean cloth from her kit and did it briskly, without fuss, and let go the moment it was tied. He flexed his fingers. The cut was shallow, but the wrap was tight enough to matter. "Thank you," he said. "Don't catch it next time." "That's the goal," he said, "generally." She was already walking back to the cabin. He watched her go for a second longer than was necessary, then followed. There was a man named Callum Fitch who ran a small spread 12 miles to the southwest and made the trip to Gareth's ranch twice each winter, once in December to swap seed stock information, and once in February for reasons that were less official and generally involved the bottle of rye whiskey he kept under his wagon seat. Gareth had known Fitch for 6 years. He was loud, good-natured, and constitutionally unable to stop himself from commenting on things that weren't his business. He arrived on a Thursday afternoon in the second week of December with his wagon and his 2 horses and his opinions, and Gareth saw him coming down the valley road from 3 miles out and had just enough time to consider warning Elsa and decide against it on the grounds that Elsa was more than capable of managing an encounter with Callum Fitch. This assessment proved correct, though the dynamics were not exactly what he'd anticipated. Fitch pulled up and climbed down and looked at the cabin and the yard, and then at Elsa, who had come out to see who was arriving, with the unfiltered curiosity of a man who had heard things and was now updating his understanding against the evidence. "Well," Fitch said, pulling off his hat, "you're nothing like what I expected." "People keep saying that," Elsa said. Fitch laughed. He was the kind of man who laughed easily and often, which Gareth had always found both likable and exhausting. "What I mean is, Hollow described you as, well, he was specific about what he was looking for." "He made a list," Elsa said. "He mentioned it to you?" "He did not have to. The agency described it to me." She looked at Gareth with the particular expression she reserved for observations that didn't require words, and he felt his neck get warm. "Come inside," Gareth said to Fitch. "It's cold." They had coffee and Fitch talked, which was his primary activity in any situation. He talked about his own livestock situation, which was complicated, and the road condition between the valley and Billings, which was poor, and the Halverson family over on the eastern edge of the valley, whose oldest boy had apparently broken his leg falling from a loft and was laid up for the foreseeable future. "They're going to be short-handed through the worst of winter," Fitch said. 5 kids, and the 2 oldest girls are doing men's work right now. Martha Halverson looks like she hasn't slept in 2 weeks. Elsa was quiet for a moment. "Do they need food?" Fitch looked at her. "Probably wouldn't refuse it." "I have a preserved ham," she said to Gareth, "and I can put together jars from the cellar if someone is going that direction." "I can go that direction," Fitch said immediately. Gareth watched her. She hadn't asked him if it was all right to offer his stores. She'd made the assessment and offered them the way she made most decisions, from the conclusion backward, without asking permission first. He thought about saying something about this and decided, again, against it, mostly because she wasn't wrong. "Take the ham," he said. "I'll have her put together a box." Fitch watched them during the exchange with the attentiveness of a man building a mental image he'd be reporting to his wife that evening. He was not subtle about it. "You know," he said when Elsa had gone to the cellar, "I heard you were expecting something different." "You heard correctly," Gareth said. "And?" "And what?" Fitch grinned into his coffee cup. "Never mind," he said. "I generally prefer it when you say that," Gareth said. Oh, what happened after Fitch left was not dramatic. Dramatic things, in Gareth's experience, announce themselves. This did not. It accumulated the way water cuts stone, not by force but by repetition, by the steady application of something small over a long period of time. They were out of agreement about any number of things. The organization of the tack shed, the correct response to a cow with a minor infection, whether to order seed from the Billings supplier or try the new one out of Helena that had better flax varieties but unknown reliability, whether dogs should be allowed to sleep inside during the cold nights. She had opinions about this that he didn't share, and Dog had opinions about it too, and he was outnumbered. "He's a working dog," Gareth said one evening, watching Dog arrange himself beside the stove with the self-satisfaction of a conquered territory. "He's cold," Elsa said, not looking up. "He has fur. He also has the good sense to prefer warm. If I let him sleep inside, he'll refuse to work outside." She looked up then. He's sleeping 3 feet from the door. The moment you go out in the morning, he'll go with you. He's not complicated." Gareth looked at the dog. Dog looked back at him with the alert, slightly apologetic expression of a person who knows they're the subject of a disagreement. "He'd better not get on the furniture," Gareth said. "Naturally," said Elsa, in a tone that suggested this was not a battle she intended to fight tonight. Dog was on the chair the following evening. Gareth said nothing about it. He suspected he'd already lost and that making an issue of it would only confirm the loss. It was in these small capitulations and counterpositions that something was being built, though neither of them would have called it that. They were learning each other in the way people learn a piece of terrain, not all at once, but gradually, filling in the map with each passing over. He learned that she went quiet when she was genuinely troubled by something, as opposed to the controlled, deliberate quiet she deployed when she was thinking. He learned that she had a sharp, dry wit that appeared unexpectedly, and that she seemed almost surprised by her own humor, as if it caught her off guard too. He learned that she read every evening before sleep, and that the German book with the cracked spine was a novel she'd read before, based on the way she turned certain pages more slowly, braced for something she already knew was coming. She learned he assumed her own catalog of him. He didn't ask what was in it. He wasn't sure he wanted to know. What he knew was that the ranch was running better. Not spectacularly. It was December in Montana. And there was no spectacular version of December in Montana. But better. The cold cellar was more efficiently organized. The hay was holding well since they'd moved it. The mending on the horse blankets, which he'd been putting off since September, was done. She'd done it herself one evening while he worked on the harness, sitting across the table from him in the lamplight, and they'd talked, not about anything significant, about Fitch and his wife, whom Gareth liked better than Fitch, and about the seed question. And at some point the conversation had slipped into something easier, less structured, the way conversation does when two people have stopped performing their positions and started simply talking. He'd said something about his brother. He hadn't meant to. It wasn't a subject he opened by intention. His brother Marcus had gone to Oregon in '76 and died of fever in '79, and there wasn't much to say about it that Gareth hadn't already said to himself at various points over the years. But it came out somehow, connected to something else they'd been discussing, and he'd said it and then become aware that he'd said it, and sat with that. She didn't make a production of it. She asked one question, where Marcus had been headed in Oregon, what he'd intended to do there, and listened to the answer and nodded, and said that her younger sister had gone to Hamburg to work in a textile mill, and that they wrote letters, but the letters took months, and sometimes the months between letters felt like a distance more than just geography. He understood this without her explaining it further. Some losses are the absence of living people, which is its own particular kind of hard. "Do you miss Germany?" he asked. She thought about it honestly, which he appreciated because he'd noticed she didn't answer reflexively. "I miss some things," she said. "I miss my sister. I miss the smell of the bakery near our house in the morning. I miss having people around who had known me since I was small." She paused. "But I don't miss the—" She searched for the word narrowness. The way a life could already be decided for you before you were old enough to argue about it. Here is too wide sometimes, too empty. But I chose the direction I traveled. That is not a small thing. He thought about this. "No," he said. "It's not." The lamp between them sat steady in the still air of the cabin. Outside, the temperature was falling again. He could hear it in the way the wind changed pitch in the cottonwoods, that low, specific moan that meant the thermometer was dropping. In 2 hours, he'd need to add wood. "I didn't want to come to a ranch," she said after a while. He looked up. "The agency gave me options. There was a man in Denver who needed a housekeeper, a man in Cheyenne with a dry goods business. And you." She ran her thumb along the edge of her book cover. "I chose the ranch because I didn't want to be inside all day, and because the land sounded real." She glanced up at him. "Your letter was very short." "I'm not a long letter writer." "No." The corner of her mouth moved. "But what you wrote was honest. I could tell the difference." He didn't know what to do with this, so he looked at the table. "You wrote a long letter," he said. "I had more to say." "You always have more to say." "Is that a criticism?" He considered. "No," he said, and realized as he said it that he meant it. Outside, the wind pressed at the cabin walls and the cold settled deeper into the valley, and the stove ticked and the lamp burned. Dog shifted against the chair leg, and exhaled the deep, boneless sigh of an animal that has secured a good position and knows it. Neither of them moved to end the evening. That, Gareth would think later, not the dramatic moments, not the arguments or the resolved disagreements, or the morning she'd first smiled at him without reservation. But this, the simple fact that neither of them moved to end the evening, was where something between them turned. Not into anything he had a name for yet, but into something. The cold that settled into the valley in the third week of December was the kind that stopped being a temperature and became a geography, a place you moved through carefully, aware at every moment of its terms. The thermometer outside the cabin door read 8 degrees on a Tuesday morning and didn't climb above 12 by midday, and Gareth spent that Tuesday and the Wednesday following doing the kind of work that cold like that demands, checking every animal twice, breaking ice from the troughs with a long-handled axe, plugging the gap that had opened near the barn's east wall where the wind found its way through and turned the interior 10 degrees colder than it needed to be. Elsa worked alongside him through most of it. She'd developed, over the preceding weeks, an accurate instinct for which tasks needed 2 people and which he could manage alone, and she deployed herself accordingly without being directed. He'd stopped being surprised by this. He'd started relying on it in ways he hadn't fully examined. On Thursday morning, she didn't come out of the second room when he got up. He noticed it the way he noticed most things. Not immediately, but after a beat, when the pattern he'd grown accustomed to didn't follow. The door stayed closed. He built the fire himself and put water on for coffee and waited, and when 20 minutes had passed, he knocked on the doorframe. "Elsa?" A pause. "I'm awake." Her voice was different, compressed somehow, thinner than usual. "You all right?" Another pause, longer. "I think I'm not feeling well." He pushed the door open. She was in the bed, which was unusual. She was always up and moving before he had his boots on. She'd pulled the blankets up, and her face above them had a quality he didn't like, a dull flush across the cheeks and a flatness to the eyes that wasn't sleep. He crossed to the bed and put the back of his hand to her forehead, the way his mother had done it, because it was the only way he knew. She was hot. Not mildly warm, but genuinely hot, the kind of heat a body makes when it's fighting something hard. "How long?" he asked. "I felt tired yesterday. I thought it was the work." She blinked slowly. "I didn't want to say anything." He pulled up the chair from the corner and sat beside the bed. "Fever," he said. "I know. The nearest doctor is in Billings." She looked at him steadily. The flush in her cheeks was high and bright. "I know that too." Billings was 40 miles in summer on a decent road. In the current conditions, the road packed with ice and the temperature sitting at 8 degrees and the sky looking the way it had been looking for the past 2 days, heavy and gray and undecided about whether to snow again, 40 miles was not a journey. It was a calculation about what you were willing to risk and whether the risk was worth the reward, and the calculation was not simple. "It might not go deep," he said. "It might not," she agreed. "I'll make broth." She started to say something about getting up, and he said, "Stay in the bed," with enough flatness that she closed her mouth and stayed. He wasn't sure she would have obeyed if she'd had more energy. He was grateful that she didn't, just now. He'd dealt with sick livestock his whole adult life, which had given him a practical understanding of fever's mechanics without much of the medical vocabulary. He knew that fever was the body's method, not its failure, that it was doing something deliberate, burning against something, and that the primary task was to support the body while it did that work, keep the patient warm but not overheated, get fluid in, watch for the signs that said the body was losing the argument. He made broth from the stock Elsa kept perpetually simmering on the back of the stove, which she had taught him without intending to teach him, simply by doing it where he could observe. He added salt. He brought it to her in the second room and she drank half of it, and that was more than he'd expected, which he took as a reasonable sign. By midday the fever had climbed. He could tell by the way her eyes moved, slightly too slow, slightly too large in their focus, as if the world had acquired a new texture she was trying to interpret. She answered his questions when he asked them, but volunteered nothing, which was so unlike her that it frightened him in a way he couldn't have prepared for. He did the afternoon feeding in half his normal time, moving through the tasks with the focused efficiency of a man who needs to be somewhere else. The cattle were fine. The horses were fine. Dog followed him at a close and anxious distance, which was unusual. Dog was not typically an anxious animal. She's all right, Gareth told him, which was not entirely true, but was the version he was working toward. Dog didn't look convinced. He went and sat outside the second room door when they came back inside, which was, Gareth supposed, as useful as anything either of them could do at the moment. The fever broke its first promise that night and made a worse one. Gareth was sitting by the stove when he heard her moving in the second room, not the ordinary movement of a person shifting in sleep, but something more agitated, restless. He went to the doorway and looked in, and she was awake, propped on one elbow, and the flush on her face had deepened to a color that made him pull the chair over without thinking and sit down beside her. Gareth! His name in her mouth, direct and clear, still had the quality of something new, even now. Right here. I'm very hot. I know. That's the fever. I'm aware it's the fever. A flash of herself, dry, precise, through the delirium. It steadied him more than he expected. I had this once before. When I was 14. It went for 5 days. 5 days, he repeated. My mother sat with me. She lay back against the pillow and looked at the ceiling. The firelight from the main room came through the doorway and moved across her face. She sang to me. I don't remember all of it. I remember her hands. He sat with this for a moment. He didn't sing. He didn't have his mother's hands or anyone else's. What he had was the chair and the ability to stay in it. I can read to you, he said. She turned her head on the pillow and looked at him. Her eyes were glassy, but they were still hers, still tracking. You don't have to do that. I know. You have work in the morning. The work will be there. She was quiet for a moment. Then she said, the book on the shelf, the German one. She paused. There's an English one beside it. Shakespeare. Sonnets. Another pause. I'm not asking for Shakespeare. I'm telling you the English one is available. I know what a sonnet is, he said, with mild indignation. I didn't say you didn't. He got the book. He pulled the lamp closer. He opened it to the first page and read, slowly, in the flat, careful voice of a man more accustomed to numbers and reports than to poetry. And she lay with her eyes half closed and the fever burning in her face and listened. He stumbled on words twice. He mispronounced one badly enough that she corrected him from the pillow without opening her eyes, which told him she was still in there, still paying attention, still herself beneath the illness. And he read better after that, more carefully, as if being assessed. He read for an hour. Then he put more wood on the fire and went back to the chair and sat. 3 days. That was how long the fever ran hard, holding at a height that kept him close and kept sleep out of reach. He developed a routine around her illness the way he developed routines around everything, not by planning it, but by doing the same things enough times that they became the shape of the day. Broth in the morning and again at midday. The lamp angled so she had light without glare. The fire maintained at a steady heat, not roaring, not low, just steady. He read to her in the evenings, an hour or more, working through the sonnet book and then, at her direction, a second book from her shelf. A collection of essays she'd carried from Germany, whose English translation she owned separately, and which was, he discovered, more interesting than he'd expected. He did the essential ranch work and nothing else. He fed and watered and did what couldn't be postponed and came back. Fitch would have been alarmed to see how much got set aside. All the things Gareth Hollow would ordinarily never have left undone in winter. The fence repair at the north pasture, the harness that still needed resoling, the inventory that should have been counted by December's end. He set them all aside. He didn't examine why. Examining the interior workings of a decision was not something he did naturally, and this one had been made without deliberation anyway. It simply was, the way certain things simply are when you stop arguing with yourself about them. On the second night, she was lucid enough to be frustrated by her own condition, which he had learned was a more reliable indicator of her well-being than any temperature. She attempted to sit up with the stated intention of going to the kitchen, and he blocked the doorway with his arm. I can make my own broth, she said. You made it for 3 months? I can manage it for 3 days. You put too much salt in it. You've been eating it anyway. She looked at his arm across the doorway. She didn't have the strength to push past it, and they both knew it, which seemed to irritate her more than anything else. I'm not an invalid. No, he agreed. You're sick. There's a difference. A patronizing one. You told me once there's a difference between criticizing and observing. He held her gaze. I'm observing that you've had a fever for 2 days and you'd fall down before you got to the stove. She opened her mouth. She closed it. She sat back down on the edge of the bed with the particular dignity of someone conceding a point they find objectionable. The broth needs black pepper, she said. I'll add pepper. Not too much. I'll use my judgment. She gave him the look that meant she had opinions about his judgment and had decided this was not the moment to express them. He brought her the broth with what he considered a reasonable amount of pepper. She drank it without commenting on the pepper, which he chose to interpret as approval. The morning of the third day, he came into the second room before dawn with the lamp and found her sitting up, upright, with the German book open in her lap, and her color changed. The flush was lower, less angry, and her eyes when she looked up at him were clear in a way they hadn't been since Tuesday morning. He stopped in the doorway. The fever broke, she said. He looked at her for a moment. The relief that moved through him was bigger than he'd anticipated, bigger than a practical man could reasonably account for, and it caught him off guard in the way that only the things you didn't know you were bracing against can catch you off guard. He looked away from her face to the lamp he was carrying and adjusted his grip on it. When? He asked. A few hours ago. I woke up and I was just cold, normally cold, and the aching had stopped. She watched him. I'm all right, Gareth. I can see that. You can sit down. I was going to start the fire. Sit down first. He sat down. The chair was where he'd been leaving it, pulled up close to the bedside, and he sat in it and set the lamp on the small crate that served as her bedside table and looked at his hands, which was where he tended to look when he didn't know where else to. You didn't sleep, she said. I slept. You slept in the chair. He didn't answer this. She was quiet for a moment. He could feel her watching him. You read to me for, she paused, I think 4 hours on the second night. I wasn't fully awake, but I could hear you. I knew your voice. He looked up. She was looking at him with the complicated expression he'd first seen across the dinner table weeks ago, the one that said she was recalculating something, revising an internal model against new information. But it was different now. Whatever had been held in reserve in that expression before was not held in reserve anymore. You didn't have to do any of it, she said. I know. The work will be there. He said it the same way he'd said it 2 nights ago, and she recognized it, and something moved across her face that he couldn't name and made no attempt to. I'm going to need a day, she said, before I'm useful again. Take 2. 1. 2, he said. The work will still be there on the second day. She looked at him for a long moment. He met her gaze and held it, which was something he'd gotten better at without noticing the improvement. All right, she said finally. 2 days. He got up and went to start the fire. He didn't say anything else, and neither did she. But the silence that sat between them as he moved through the cabin was not the careful, managed silence of 2 strangers in close quarters. It was a different thing entirely, open in some direction he hadn't noticed a door existed, and not uncomfortable at all. She was up on the second day as he'd known she would be, not fully. She moved at a reduced pace, taking the easier tasks and leaving the heavier ones, which required a degree of self-awareness that her recovered state and natural temperament were both working against. He watched her assess a task and then, visibly, set it aside and understood that the setting aside cost her something. He took the task without comment. You don't have to do that, she said when she noticed. I know. She looked at him with the expression he was starting to recognize as her version of being at a loss. Not helpless, never helpless, but briefly without a ready response. Then she went back to what she was doing, and so did he. It was on that second afternoon, while she was at the table with her mending and he was doing the harness work he'd put off, that she said without looking up, My mother used to say that you learn who a person is in a difficulty, not in an easy time. She ran the needle through and pulled it tight. I think she was right. He worked the leather through his hands. He didn't respond immediately, which she'd learned was not dismissal. It was how he processed a thing that mattered to him. What did you learn? He said finally. She looked up then. She looked at him the way she'd looked at the valley on that first rainy evening, taking it in whole, not just the surface of it. That you're not who I expected, she said. That's not a complaint. I know it's not. It's... She stopped, considered, started again more quietly. You're better than your list, Gareth. The harness sat in his hands. Outside, the cottonwoods were loud in the wind, and the temperature was dropping again, and there were 30 things left undone from the past 4 days, and none of them, right now, were where his attention was. So are you, he said. She held his gaze for a moment. Then she looked back down at her mending, and the small movement at the corner of her mouth was enough. He found the pine boughs on the table when he came in from the early feeding on the 23rd of December. Not a few. A substantial gathering of them, laid across the table in a loose arrangement alongside a collection of other things she'd clearly been accumulating for some time without his noticing. Dried seed heads from the grasses along the creek bank, a handful of red berries from the hawthorn stand at the edge of the north pasture, several lengths of twine in different thicknesses, and a bundle of what appeared to be thin strips of birch bark peeled into pale curling ribbons. Dog was sitting beside the table, looking at the collection with professional interest, and Elsa was standing at the kitchen end of it with a length of twine and the focused expression she wore when she was in the middle of executing a plan. Gareth stood in the doorway with cold still coming off his coat and looked at the table. What is this? Decorations, she said without looking up. For what? She looked up then briefly with the expression that meant she was deciding whether the question was genuine or rhetorical. Christmas, she said, in 2 days. He looked at the pine boughs. He looked at the berries. He looked at the birch bark ribbons. I don't generally, he started. I know you don't, she said. I'm not asking you to do anything. I'm doing it myself. She went back to the twine. You can hang them if you want, or not, but I'm making them either way. He took his coat off and hung it, and sat down at the far end of the table with his coffee and watched her work, which she did with the quiet competence she brought to most physical tasks, hands moving, making decisions without deliberating, adjusting when something didn't hold the way she intended. She bound the pine boughs into a long swag and hung it along the mantel above the stove, stepping up onto the chair without asking whether that was a reasonable use of the chair. It held. She climbed down. My mother did this every year, she said, not looking at him. We didn't have much to work with, but she said the house needed to know it was Christmas or it would forget to feel like one. She reached for the berries. I know that sounds like something a child says. It sounds like something your mother said, he replied. She paused with the berries in her hand and looked at him with an expression he couldn't fully read. Not surprised, exactly. Something more like recalibrating again. The small, constant adjustment of expectation that had characterized the first weeks and that he'd thought was finished but apparently wasn't. He was still capable of catching her off guard. He wasn't sure how he felt about that, but it was something. Yes, she said. It's exactly something she said. She went back to work. He finished his coffee and after a while got up and held the end of the birch bark swag she was trying to stretch between the 2 window frames because it needed 2 sets of hands and there was no reason not to. Christmas Eve, she made stollen. He didn't know what stollen was until it came out of the oven, which was a dense, heavy fruit bread dusted with a fine coat of powdered sugar she'd been conserving since November for exactly this purpose. The cabin filled with a smell that was so specific, sweet and warm and complicated, with the dried fruit she'd been soaking since the week before, that it stopped him in the doorway of the back room when he came in from the evening feeding. She was standing at the stove with a cloth over her shoulder and flour on her forearm, checking the bottom of the loaf. She didn't look up at the sound of him stopping. It needs 10 more minutes, she said. He stood there in the doorway. The pine boughs along the mantel had released their smell as the cabin warmed through the afternoon, layering underneath the bread smell, and the birch ribbons caught the lamplight and moved slightly in the draft from the door he'd just opened and not yet closed. The whole cabin looked. He tried to find the word and could only arrive at inhabited, which wasn't quite right but was closer than anything else. He closed the door. I haven't smelled bread like that since I was a boy, he said. She set the cloth down and looked at him. Your mother baked? Every Saturday. He came further into the cabin and sat at the table. She made a white bread. Very plain. Nothing like that. But Saturday mornings the whole house smelled like... He stopped. Like you knew the week was turning over. She listened to this without comment, which was her way when he said something that mattered. She didn't fill the space around it with noise. He'd come to appreciate it, the way she listened. It was a different quality of attention than he'd encountered in most people. "She's gone?" Elsa asked. 12 years ago. A pause. "My father, a few years before that." "And Marcus." "And Marcus." He said it plainly. The name still had weight, but he'd carried it long enough that the weight was familiar. "I've been out here alone for a long time." She was quiet for a moment. Then she opened the oven and checked the bread again and decided it was ready and brought it to the table, setting it on the wooden board she used for hot things. The crust was golden, and the powdered sugar had melted slightly at the edges where the heat was highest. She cut 2 slices and put one in front of him without asking whether he wanted it. He ate it. It was dense and rich and sweet in a way that was completely foreign to the daily food of the ranch, which tended toward the plain and the sustaining over the celebratory. "This is remarkable," he said. She sat across from him with her own slice and looked mildly pleased, which for her was the equivalent of another person beaming. "My grandmother's recipe. I've been making it since I was 8. You were making bread at 8. My grandmother said 7 was old enough, but that I didn't have the patience at 7. She ate a piece. She was right about that. "You have patience now," he said, and then heard the secondary meaning in it, the one he hadn't intended, but that was there anyway, and looked at his plate. She was quiet for a moment. "Some things are worth patience," she said. He looked up. She was looking at him with the same directness she always had, but quieter now, the challenge stripped out of it. He held her gaze and didn't look away. "Yeah," he said. "They are." Christmas morning came in clear and brutally cold, the thermometer below 0 for the first time that winter. The sky above the valley a hard, flat blue that meant no clouds and no wind and temperatures that would stay low all day. Gareth was up before first light the way he was every morning and went out to the barn with the lantern, and the cold hit him clean in the face the moment he opened the cabin door and took his breath and gave it back as steam. He fed and watered and broke the ice in the troughs and checked each animal with an extra pass because this kind of cold required it. And the work took longer than usual because he moved more carefully in extreme cold. Not slower, but more deliberate, the way you move on ice. Each step placed with intention. He was back inside by the time the sky had shifted from black to the low gray blue of a winter dawn. Elsa was up and the fire was built and the coffee was on. She was standing at the window that faced east, watching the light change over the ridge, her hands wrapped around her mug. She'd put her hair up, but not completely. It was pinned at the back of her neck, but loose around her face in the way it got when she'd done it without a mirror, which was most mornings. She turned when he came in and looked at him. "How cold?" "Below 0, maybe 8, 10 below." He hung his coat. "Animals are fine. Extra bedding in the barn last night helped." She nodded and handed him a mug of coffee without him asking, which she'd started doing sometime in November and which he'd stopped noticing sometime in November, which was itself a fact worth noticing if he'd been paying that kind of attention. "Merry Christmas," she said. He took the mug. "Merry Christmas, Elsa." They stood there for a moment, with the fire going strong and the cold outside pressing at the windows, and the cabin smelling of pine and the last of the stolen from the night before. Dog was on the chair, curled with his nose under his tail, providing no useful function except that of a warm, breathing presence, which was its own kind of function. "I have something for you," she said. He looked at her. I know I'm not." She stopped, started again. "It isn't a gift the way you're thinking." She set her mug down and went to the shelf beside her room doorway and took down a folded piece of cloth which she brought to the table and set down. "I made this in November, before the fever. I finished it last week." He set his mug down and opened the cloth. Inside was a pair of heavy wool work gloves, knit in a dark gray that was close to the color of the winter sky, with a reinforced palm panel in a tighter stitch. He turned them over in his hands. The work was precise. He could see that even without knowing anything about knitting, the way you can see precision in any craft even if you don't practice it yourself. The reinforcement on the palm was stitched in a pattern he didn't recognize, something that might have been geometric or might have been something else. "For the fence work," she said. "Your regular gloves don't have enough palm protection. You keep catching the wire." He looked at the gloves. He looked at the reinforced palm. He thought about the cut from the baling wire 3 weeks ago that she'd wrapped without comment. "You planned these from the baling wire," he said. "I planned them from before the baling wire," she said. "But that confirmed the necessity." He didn't know what to say that was proportionate to the thing, so he said the plain version of it. Thank you. They'll wear out eventually, but they should last through the winter. He set them down on the table and looked at them for another moment. Then he said, Wait here, and went to the back room, his room, the original room, and came back with something he'd been keeping on the high shelf since early December, wrapped in a piece of burlap. He set it on the table in front of her. She looked at him, then at the wrapped object, then at him again. You said you didn't... I said I didn't get anything, he said. I didn't say I hadn't made anything. She unwrapped the burlap. Inside was a small wooden box, roughly 6 inches by 4, made from the walnut offcuts he'd had in the tack shed. Good wood, dark and close-grained, that he'd been saving without specific purpose. The lid fit cleanly and had a small carved groove at the front for a thumbnail. He was not a skilled woodworker and hadn't tried to make it look like he was. The joinery was plain, the finish was simply sanded smooth and oiled, and the single decorative element was a line of very small letters carved along the lid's edge that spelled out, in careful if slightly uneven lettering, her full name, Elsa Reinhardt, her name from before. Not from any arrangement, just her name. She looked at it for a long moment. She lifted the lid and looked inside, which was empty. It was made to be filled with whatever she chose to put in it. She ran her thumb along the letters on the edge, and he watched her face do something complicated and quiet that she didn't try to control the way she usually controlled her face. For the things you carry from Bremen, he said by way of explanation. The small ones, the ones that need a place. She looked up. Her eyes were bright in the lamplight, and she didn't look away from him. You made this, she said. It took me 3 tries to get the lid to fit. She made a sound that was almost a laugh but came out different. She pressed her lips together and looked back down at the box and ran her finger along the lid again. You carved my name. It's your box. My name from before, she said. It's still your name. She set the box down on the table, gently, and was quiet for a long moment. He stood on his side of the table and gave her the quiet, the way she gave him quiet when it was needed. Outside, the cold held the valley absolutely still. The fire was the only sound. My father made my mother a box, she said finally, for her letters. She kept it by her bed until she died. She looked at the grain of the wood. I didn't know that was what I was going to see when I opened the burlap. He didn't know what to say to that, so he said nothing, which was sometimes the right answer. She cleared her throat. She looked up at him with the steady, direct gaze that was the most essentially her thing about her. Sit down, Gareth. He sat. She put her hands flat on the table. I want to say something, and I want to say it plainly, so there's no... She paused. So there's no confusion about what I mean. All right. When I came here, I told you this was a working arrangement between 2 practical people. And it was. It was that. She looked at the box, then back at him. It isn't only that anymore. I don't know when it changed, but it has, and I don't think it serves either of us to pretend otherwise. He held very still. I'm not asking you for anything, she said. I'm not asking you to... She stopped, started again. I know you're not a man who says things easily. I'm not asking you to say things. I'm telling you what's true for me, and I'm telling you plainly because I don't know another way to be. She met his eyes. This is real for me. Whatever it is, it's real. The fire went on doing what fires do. Dog made a small sound in his sleep. The cabin held them both. Gareth looked at his hands on the table. He looked at the gloves she'd made him, sitting folded beside his mug. He looked at her hands on the table, and then at her face, and held it. I know, he said. It's real for me too. He said it plainly, the same way she had, because plain was the only way he had. He didn't embellish it, or walk it back, or look away when he said it. He said it like a man who has considered the truth of a thing for a long time and has decided that the time for not saying it is over. She exhaled. Not dramatically. It was small, almost private, the release of something she'd been holding without knowing she was holding it. She nodded once. Good, she said. That's good. They sat with it for a moment. Not uncomfortably. More the way 2 people sit after something significant and let it settle before they figure out what comes next. The cattle will need a midday check in this cold, he said eventually. I know, she said. I'll need help with the east trough. It'll be solid by noon. I'll come out at noon. He nodded. He picked up his coffee. She picked up hers. They sat at the table on Christmas morning in the cold valley with the pine boughs on the mantel and the carved box between them and the names of all the losses and the distance each of them had traveled, written invisibly in the air of the small cabin, and neither of them felt the need to say anything more about it just yet. The words had been said. They were enough, and they would hold. The east trough was solid by noon, exactly as he'd predicted, and they broke it together with 2 axes in the hard, flat cold of Christmas midday, working from opposite ends toward the center, the way they'd learned to split tasks. Not by assigning roles, but by reading the situation and filling whatever needed filling. Elsa's axe work was efficient, if not powerful. She told him once, early on, that she knew her own strength and didn't pretend to have more of it than she did. And this was true. She worked within her range and didn't waste energy trying to operate outside it. He'd come to think of this as one of the more underrated qualities a person could have. He'd known plenty of men who couldn't say the same. They finished the trough and checked the cattle and walked back to the cabin through the bright, ferocious cold with their breath steaming and the snow squeaking under their boots, the way it only squeaked when the temperature was genuinely serious. He held the cabin door open. She went in first without commenting on the gesture, which told him she'd accepted it as ordinary, which meant it had become ordinary, which meant something about how much had shifted without either of them marking the moment it did. Inside, warming their hands at the stove, she said, "I want to ask you something, and I want you to think about it honestly before you answer." "That's generally how I answer things," he said. "Not always." She said it without edge. "Sometimes you answer before you've thought, and then you think, and then you don't correct yourself because correcting yourself feels like losing." He opened his mouth. He closed it. He turned back to the stove. "What's the question? What do you want this to be?" She wasn't looking at him. She was looking at her own hand spread above the heat. Not what it is, what you want it to be. He understood the distinction. What it was 2 people who had told each other the truth that morning and were now standing in the same room with that truth between them, which was already more than he'd had in a very long time. What he wanted it to be was a larger question, one that carried more risk, because want implied intention. And intention implied a future. And futures in Gareth Hollow's experience had a way of not cooperating. But she'd asked plainly, the way she always asked, and she'd given him fair warning to think before he spoke. "I want it to be real," he said. "More real than an arrangement. I want—" He stopped, found the words. "I want to stop treating it like something that could still fall through." She turned her head and looked at him. "And I think we should get married properly." He said it to the stove, then made himself turn and say it to her face. "Not because of the agency or the list or any of that. Because I want to. Because you're—" He stopped again. This part was harder. "You're the best thing that's happened to this ranch in 11 years. And that's not what I mean to say, but it's part of it." "It's an interesting way to propose," she said. "I'm not good at this." "You're not bad at it." She held his gaze. Her face was composed, but her eyes were doing something else. Bright and complicated and entirely present. "I want that too, the real version. Not because of any obligation." She paused. "But I want to keep my name." He blinked. "What?" "Reinhardt. I want to keep it." She watched him carefully. "Not instead of yours, alongside it. Elsa Reinhardt Hollow, if that's a thing that can be done. I won't disappear my own name because of a marriage. It's what I came from." He thought about this. He thought about the box he'd made her with her name on it, her name from before. He thought about what she'd said when she'd seen it, "My name from before." And what he'd said back, "It's still your name." "That's a thing that can be done," he said. Something released in her shoulders. A small thing, barely visible. The kind of release that only happens when a person has been holding against a possibility they didn't want to name. "All right," she said. "Then yes." "Yes," he repeated, because he wanted to hear the word land in the room and stay there. "Yes," she said again, and she was almost smiling, and this time he was certain. They were married in February, not in Billings. The road was still difficult and the weather was unpredictable, and neither of them wanted the production of a town ceremony with its attendant commentary from people who had opinions about their arrangement that they hadn't been invited to have. Fitch knew a justice of the peace in the valley, a man named Aldrin Watts, who had a small farm 8 miles north, and who performed civil ceremonies with the brisk professionalism of someone who understood that a legal fact was a legal fact and didn't require theater. Watts came to the ranch on a Saturday morning in the second week of February with Fitch and Fitch's wife Clara, a small, perceptive woman whom Gareth had always liked better than Fitch, and who took one look at Elsa and appeared to make a comprehensive assessment of the situation in approximately 45 seconds. "You're exactly what this ranch needed," Clara told Elsa, in the kitchen, while Gareth and Fitch and Watts stood awkwardly in the main room pretending to discuss cattle prices. "I'm what it got," Elsa said, which was not quite agreement and not quite disagreement, and which Clara apparently found satisfying because she nodded and moved on. The ceremony itself took 12 minutes. Watts read the required language with the practiced pace of a man who had done it many times, and Gareth and Elsa stood in the main room of the cabin under the pine bough swag that had dried out and lost most of its green, but that Elsa had left up anyway, and said the words when they were supposed to say them, and it was not elegant or dramatic or accompanied by anything except the sound of the stove and dog rearranging himself on the chair, and at one point, one of the horses being audible from the barn. When Watts said they could proceed and Gareth took Elsa's hand, properly, for the first time, not the practical contact of the cold work or the fence line or the fever care, but deliberately his hand around hers, she looked at him with the expression he'd first seen across the dinner table months ago, the one that meant she was revising her understanding of something, except now he knew what it meant. It meant she was paying full attention. It meant whatever was happening mattered enough to look at directly. He held her hand and looked back and didn't look away. After, Clara produced a cake she'd made and brought in a tin, which was dense and slightly lopsided and very good, and they ate it at the table with coffee while Fitch talked and Watts accepted a second slice, and outside the February cold held the valley in its grip the way it had been holding it for months. "To Hollow and his very unexpected wife," Fitch said, raising his coffee cup. "Reinhardt Hollow," Elsa said pleasantly. Fitch blinked. "Beg pardon?" "Elsa Reinhardt Hollow." She said it without heat, the same way she said most things that were not negotiable. "That is my name." Fitch looked at Gareth. Gareth looked back at him with an expression that communicated, efficiently, that this was not a subject on which Fitch's input had been solicited. Fitch looked back at Elsa. He raised his cup again. "To Elsa Reinhardt Hollow," he said, with the slightly chastened cheerfulness of a man who had been gently corrected and was trying to appear unaffected. Clara caught Gareth's eye from across the table and gave him a look that said she approved of something, though he wasn't entirely sure what. He suspected it was Elsa in general. He couldn't argue with the assessment. Spring came late to the valley, the way spring always came late in that country. Reluctantly, in fits, with several retreats back into cold and gray that made you wonder whether it had decided to come at all. But it came. It always came. The creek rose with the snow melt and ran loud and brown and strong, and the grass began to come back in the low ground along its banks, and the cattle moved differently, spreading out from the tight winter groupings into the loose grazing patterns of animals who had been cold and confined and were now neither. There was a morning in late April when Gareth stood at the top of the east ridge and looked down at the valley and took a quiet account of what he could see. The cabin with smoke rising from it. She'd be at the stove or already out at the barn, depending on what the morning had needed. The hay storage rebuilt after the winter, better organized than it had been before. The north pasture fence repaired along the full east-west line, solid now in a way it hadn't been in years. The new gate on the south pasture with a working latch. The cattle spread out and healthy, 46 head now, 3 calves born in March, all of them standing. It didn't look dramatically different from the valley he'd stood above in other Aprils. That was the thing about actual change. It rarely looked like the before and after of a transformation. It looked like the same land with different numbers. But the numbers were different, and the numbers were what kept a ranch alive or didn't. He heard her coming up the ridge path before he saw her. Her footsteps were particular, quick and deliberate, not the slow climb of someone who found the hill difficult. She came up beside him and stood looking down at the valley, her hair loose under her hat, her coat open because the morning was warmer than it had any right to be. "The Halverson boy sent word," she said. "His leg's healed. He's asking if we need a hand through the spring work." "How old is he?" 17. "His mother says he's reliable." Gareth looked at the valley below. The south pasture fence, the east line, the barn roof that still had a soft spot he'd patched twice and that needed a proper fix before next winter. "Tell him yes," he said. "2 weeks, maybe 3. We'll see how he does." She nodded. She looked out at the valley with him. They stood in the specific comfortable quiet of two people who had shared enough space and enough difficulty to have built something that didn't require filling with words. "What are you counting?" she asked. He looked at her sideways. "What?" "You have a counting face. You were counting something when I came up." He was briefly annoyed by how accurately she read him, and then wasn't. "The cattle. The improvements from winter." He paused. "The things still left to do." She looked out at the pastures. "The barn roof." "The barn roof," he agreed. "The south fence needs a new post at the corner." 3 posts, actually. "And we should be thinking about expanding the root cellar before fall. We put up more than it can hold this year." He looked at her. She was still looking at the valley with the same survey the terrain expression she'd worn on that first rainy evening when he'd stopped the wagon at the ridge and let her see the land for the first time. Except now she knew every corner of it. She'd walked most of it. She'd repaired parts of it and organized parts of it and argued with him about most of it. And she knew it the way you know a place you've worked, in your hands and your feet and the specific quality of attention that develops when something has cost you something. "You love this land," he said. He didn't mean it as a compliment exactly, more as an observation, the kind she was always making about him. She was quiet for a moment. "I love what we've done with it," she said carefully. "The land was here before us. It'll be here after." She glanced at him. "But yes, I think I do. Even with the winters. The winters are the most honest part of it." He thought about this. He thought about the thermometer at 8 below, and the broken ice in the troughs, and the days of the fever, and the chair beside the bed, and the way the cold had clarified things that the easier seasons left vague. "Yeah," he said, "that's true." She turned to look at him directly. "I want to write to my sister," she said. "I've been writing letters, but I want to tell her to come visit, not to stay. She has her life in Hamburg, but to come see this." She gestured at the valley. "To see what this is. That's a long journey for a visit." "I know." She met his eyes. "But she should know I'm all right. She should see it, not just read it in a letter." He thought about Marcus, who had sent letters from Oregon for 2 years and whom he had never gone to see, and who was gone before the thought ever converted into action. That was the specific, quiet guilt of a man who had let distance do the work of absence. He knew it well. He carried it still. "Write to her," he said. "Tell her to come." Elsa nodded. Something settled in her expression that had been slightly unresolved since she'd started the subject. He understood then that she hadn't been asking permission. She'd been asking whether he understood why it mattered. There was a difference. She had taught him the difference. They stood on the ridge for another minute, looking at the valley below. The morning was warming around them. Somewhere along the creek, a bird was working, a sound that meant something about the season turning, about what was over and what was starting. "The Halverson boy," he said, moving. "I'll go by tomorrow and talk to him directly. Better than sending word back through a third party. He'll appreciate that." "How do you know?" "Because he's 17 and his father's laid up, and someone treating him like a man he can become is going to matter more than what he's paid." She started back down the ridge. "I'll have something on the stove by the time you're back from the barn." He watched her start down the path. "Elsa." She turned. He didn't have a prepared thing to say. He'd started her name because something had needed saying, and the name was the first part of it. He stood there for a second with the morning all around them and the valley below, and the particular light of late April in Montana, which was thin and honest and didn't flatter anything. "I was wrong about what I was looking for," he said. "When I made the list." She stood on the path below him and looked up. "I know." "You're not what I was looking for." "I know that too. You're what I needed. There's a difference." He said it plainly, the way she'd taught him to say things that mattered, without dressing it up or walking it back. "I didn't know that when you stepped off the train. I didn't know it for a long time." She looked at him for a moment. The wind moved her hair across her face, and she didn't push it away. "When did you know?" she asked. He thought about it honestly. "The chair," he said. "When I was sitting in the chair beside your bed and reading to you, and you were asleep and couldn't hear it anymore. I kept reading anyway. He paused. That's when I knew. She was very still on the path. Then she said, I heard you. You said you were asleep. I said I wasn't fully awake. Those aren't the same thing. She held his gaze. I heard you. I knew your voice, and I knew it meant I wasn't alone. She paused. That's when I knew too. The morning held them both in the particular silence of two people who have said the true thing and don't need to say anything more about it. He came down the path. She walked beside him toward the cabin. Dog appeared from somewhere near the fence line and fell in ahead of them the way he always did, leading with the authority of an animal who had decided on his affiliations and saw no reason to revisit them. The years didn't make everything smooth. That's not how years work, and anyone who tells you differently is selling something. There were arguments that lasted longer than they should have. There was a summer of poor rain and reduced grass that made everything harder and shorter than it needed to be and put a specific kind of pressure on two people who already handled pressure in different ways. There was a winter, 3 years in, when the cattle losses were bad enough that they sat at the table together after the final count, and neither of them could think of what to say that would make the number different. So they said nothing and sat with it, and in the morning they started the work of what came next. They had 2 children. A girl first, Anna, who came out loud and curious and developed opinions before she could reliably walk, which surprised no one who knew her mother. A boy 4 years later named Marcus, without extended discussion. Elsa had suggested it, simply and directly, and Gareth had looked at her across the kitchen and understood that she had been carrying that suggestion for some time and had chosen the right moment to offer it, and he'd said yes without hesitation, and that was that. Elsa's sister visited the summer of the 3rd year. Hannah Reinhardt was smaller than Elsa and quieter, and she stood in the ranch yard on the afternoon she arrived and looked at the valley and said something in German that Gareth didn't catch. He'd been learning, slowly and badly. His German remained functional at best, which Elsa informed him regularly. What did she say? He asked Elsa later. She said it looks like you built it for her. She said that about me? She said it about us. Elsa looked out the window at her sister talking to one of the horses in the corral, which the horse appeared to find satisfactory. She said it looks like the place we built fits the people we are. He thought about this. The valley, the cabin, the expanded root cellar they'd finally put in the previous fall, the new posts on the south fence, the barn roof properly repaired, the 49 head of cattle that had become 63 over 3 years of careful work, the room with the door he'd hung in December of the 1st year, the shelf with the carved box beside her books, the chair that was still, technically, Dog's chair. Does it? He asked. She turned from the window and looked at him. Her face was familiar to him now, in the way that a landscape becomes familiar. Not diminished by familiarity, but richer, the known details accumulating into something more than any single observation. She was 31 years old, and there were lines around her eyes from squinting in the outdoor light, and her hands were strong and capable, and she still argued with him on a near-daily basis about any number of things, and the arguing had never stopped being the thing that told him she was fully present, fully engaged, fully invested in whatever they were building. Better every year, she said. Outside, the valley caught the afternoon light the way it always did. Coming in from the west over the ridge, laying long and golden across the grass, making the ordinary beautiful in the unhurried way that particular kind of light always had. The creek ran where it always ran. The cottonwoods were summer-full and noisy in a light wind. Gareth Hollow had come to this valley alone with a list of 17 requirements and a plan that had failed completely in the first 10 minutes of its execution, and the failure had given him everything. Not because failure was supposed to be a gift, it wasn't most of the time, but because what stepped off that train in Billings on a gray October morning had been exactly what he was least prepared for and exactly what the life he was living required. And the distance between those two things was the whole story. He hadn't been looking for a partner. He'd been looking for compliance. What he'd gotten was someone who would tell him when the fence was bad and mend it herself if he didn't get to it, who would make soup from what was available and make it well, who would sit through a fever without asking for more than honesty, who would put her name alongside his and keep her own name too because she had come from somewhere and that somewhere was real and worth carrying. She had taught him things he hadn't known he was missing. How to say what mattered plainly. how to hear a disagreement without treating it as an attack, how to stay in the chair. He'd taught her things too, he thought, though she would have enumerated them differently and possibly more accurately. He'd taught her that a man who didn't say much could still mean everything. He'd taught her that a place could become a home, not because it was built to be one, but because the people inside it decided daily to treat it that way. That was the actual truth of it. Not a love story with a clear moment of transformation, not a frontier legend with heroes and perfect resolution. Two difficult people who had chosen, repeatedly, against their own stubbornness and fear and the long-established habits of people who had been alone, to keep building something together. Most mornings weren't beautiful. Most evenings were tired. Most of the arguments were about things that didn't matter as much as the arguing made them seem. But in the long count, the kind you do from a ridge at the end of a late April morning, looking at what exists now that didn't exist before, the tally ran one direction. It ran toward more. And that, in the end, was what the land was for. Not just to survive on, but to build something on that lasted past the building of it. Something that was still standing in the morning, and the morning after that, and the ones after those, because the people who made it had decided that staying was the work, and had done the work, and hadn't stopped. Gareth Hollow had made a list. It was wrong about almost everything. The train had delivered someone better.